Welcome and thank you for joining us for our Zoom conference titled Excluding Violence from Reform, the Surprising Truth About Violence and Recidivism. Everyone at Safe and Just Michigan is thrilled you are participating. We've muted your microphones to ensure that everyone can hear the panel, but please ask any questions you have using the chat function on Zoom. You'll find the chat function on the taskbar when you hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen. For anyone who has not used Zoom before, the chat button is the one that looks like a talk balloon. At the end of the panel, we will gather up and answer questions for as long as time allows. We'll be putting links to an exit survey and ways to get in contact with us on the screen and also in the chat box throughout the panel discussion. You'll also be able to find these links during the event in the chat room. For those of you who want to revisit this discussion, we are streaming this event on Safe and Just Michigan's Facebook page through Facebook Live, and later it will be put on our Safe and Just Michigan YouTube channel. You can also engage with us on our social media channels or by visiting our website. John?
Thanks, Josh. I'm John Cooper. I'm the Executive Director of Safe and Just Michigan. Today we're here to discuss exclusions of people who have committed violent crimes from criminal justice reform and other relief. This is a timely and important topic. Releases in response to the COVID pandemic have focused on nonviolent crimes, like many reforms, and objections are based on the idea that a person who committed a violent crime is likely to commit another one if released, especially if released quote unquote early. But more than half the people in prison in the United States are people who've committed violent crimes. More than 3/4 of the people in Michigan in prison have committed crimes that are defined as assaultive. So opposition to releases of people that have committed violent crimes has profound implications for our ability to reduce prison populations, reduce correction spending, and ultimately optimize our public safety investments. The empirical research about violence suggests that we should be doing things very differently. And we have 3 experts here today to help us understand the research on violent crime recidivism and its implications for criminal justice policy. I'm joined today by John Pfaff, who is a professor of law at Fordham, where he teaches criminal law, sentencing law, and law and economics. His research focuses primarily on empirical matters related to criminal justice. He is the author of Locked In, The True Causes of Mass Incarceration and How to Achieve Real Reform. We're also joined by Sonia Starr, who's a professor of law and co-director of the Empirical Legal Studies Center at the University of Michigan Law School. Professor Starr clerked for Merrick Garland on the DC Circuit, for the Shared Appeals Chamber of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia in The Hague. And she is also the co-author of a recent research paper, Understanding Violent Crime Recidivism. Finally, we're joined by Troy Rienstra, who's the outreach director at Safe and Just Michigan. Troy founded Network for Real Change and worked as a program coordinator at Church of the Servant, Prisoners in Christ. He's completed 22 years of a life sentence in Michigan, and during that time, he obtained training in critical thinking, communication, substance abuse awareness, and conflict resolution. So Troy, I'm going to start with you. To get us started, can you summarize the dominant narrative about violent crime in American culture?
Sure. Thanks, John. I'm glad to be with you all today. The dominant narrative around violence in our culture today, I would sum up as people don't change. So when a person commits an act of violence, therefore that person will be a violent person for the rest of their life. As you said, I have spent 22 years in prison. I committed an armed robbery in 1995. Unfortunately, the victim in my case, who I won't name, was shot 5 times, and fortunately, and by the grace of God, he recovered. Now, who am I today? Today, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a contributing member to my community, I'm a leader, among other people who have committed violent offenses in their past. And now we are contributing to people's thinking and the way we perceive people who have committed violence at one point in time.
In your experience, what is the the dominant narrative about violence get wrong about people?
Well, I think the why it gets it wrong is because we don't take the time to get to know people. We take people, we incarcerate them, and after they've been incarcerated, we judge them as their act and don't get to know them as a person. So I think what we get wrong is that the fact that I stated earlier is that the narrative says that people don't change. When you get to know a person who has a past, one thing that you will discover is that they're not who they used to be. That is the if they have looked internally, done some reflection, have mourned and grieved over the person they've injured, how they've impacted the community. And if they've done that and come to a realization that what they did was wrong, and now they have an obligation to give back to the community and in some form or fashion repair the damage that they've done, then by the case in point, they're no longer that person, and they can actually be redeemed and become contributing members of the community.
Thanks, Troy. John or Sonia, anything to add to that?
I think that was well stated. That I do think that you know, John and I have both tried to participate, I think, in public debate about reform in this area, and you find a lot of resistance to the idea of even among audiences who are open to criminal justice reform generally and interested in making things better for nonviolent offenders. The idea that one should that reform should encompass people with violent records is you know, borderline shocking to some people. That and so I think that's because of how deeply that the narrative that Troy described is entrenched.
And I think it's worth seeing how insidiously it worms its way into every aspect of our conversation, right? Just think about how we describe people who get convicted of a violent crime, right? We define them as a violent offender, right? That defines us who they are. This is the defining trait of that person. Not that there's someone who committed an act of violence, which is something, as you know, Sonia will explain in far more detail, people age into and age out of. And to me, the best example of just how much that term just like is inescapable. It was in my book, I literally write, we should never use the word violent offender, which my goal was to have that be the only time in the whole book, that one sentence, that phrase appears. Yet every round of edits, it popped up somewhere else, right? I just found myself just instinctively typing violent offender and catching it on like with the search function. You know, so even as I'm sitting here saying, don't talk about the word violent offender, it's too simplistic and really does real harm to how I think about things, I'm using that word myself. It's a very deep cultural impression, right? And so it's not, I get frustrated when I see the resistance that, you know, Sonia and I face when we make these points, but I'm not unsympathetic to it, right? At the same time, you know, the severity we use towards people who commit violence, it's relatively new, right? I mean, even back in the 70s, we weren't punishing at nearly this rate. You know, the stat I could point out is that even though the population of the United States has grown by about 20% since 1970, there are about just as many murders, total, not rate, total murders today as in 1970. Yet the number of people in prison just for homicide today is equal to the total prison population in 1970, right? It is just a staggering change in how we respond. So at one level, it's this deep cultural artifact that's hard to shake. On the other hand, it's kind of new, right? Which would suggest that it's not nearly as permanent and unshakable as sort of the current nastiness about this issue would seem to suggest.
And add that it's also an outlier globally, that it's not that we have to have this approach, because basically no one else has this approach, and in fact no one else in the history of the world has had this approach. And I think it's, you know, maybe it's that once something like that becomes normalized, it's hard to back away from it, and so it's going to take some concerted messaging, I think.
Yeah, and we've got I think a fairly well-informed audience, people that are interested in criminal justice reform. But it's worth saying, you know, the U.S. has 2.2 million people in prison. That's 25% of all prisoners in the entire world. And we really are an outlier for how long we send people to prison, for how many people we send to prison, and that's worth talking about.
I would actually can I add one thing about that,
Yeah,
that 2.2 number, and especially in time of COVID, I think it's really important to break that number apart, because that 2.2 number is two things added together that I personally think we shouldn't add, right? So it's 1.5 million people in prison and about 750,000 people in jail on any given night, right? But jail is defined by churn, right? And so, well, there are about it sounds like prisons are bigger than jails, 1.5 million versus 750,000. But the reality is about 10 million people churn through jails every year. And we think about 5 million of them are unique individuals, right? So certainly from a COVID perspective, jail, as distinct from prison, is really the place where people come in, they spend 4 days, they get infected, they go back to their community, they come in infected, spend 3 days infected, the correctional officer goes back to his community. Right? They are even more so than the prisons, the places that really are going to spread it to the broader community. And so I think it's really important, jail, that 750,000 number for jail really understates what jail is. Jail is an admissions factory, and it's 10 million on the jail side, which again is, I think, something that the rest of the world just doesn't experience, that level of lockup churn.
Absolutely. And, this is something we've come to focus on quite recently in Michigan as well. We had a governor's task force that the Pew Charitable Trust staffed. They put their report out in January. And, we have about 16,000 people in jail at any moment in time, but over 100,000 people cycle through annually. And it's a very different profile of person as well. It's, a lot of people from rural areas on short sentences, driving with suspended license, DUI, that sort of stuff, instead of, serious violent crime. So I want to pivot to sort of something you discuss in your book, John. There's this popular conception that mass incarceration is really the product of the war on drugs, and that much of the prison population in the United States is, quote unquote, nonviolent drug users and people serving time for drug distribution. What's wrong with this picture? So
the basic numbers are this. As things stand as of, 2018, which is the last year we had data, just came out this week, about 56% of all people are in prison for a violent crime. And that's defined by the Bureau of Justice Statistics in a very narrow way. That's murder, manslaughter, rape, sexual assault, or robbery, nothing else. Right? Other states have more expansive definitions, like New York State includes burglary of a residence is a violent crime. This doesn't include that. That's just that small set of offenses. And then it's actually worse than that, because that's the minimum. Right? And so 15% are in for drugs, 55% are in for violence. But it's important to realize that 15% in for drugs actually probably overstates the number who are actually in prison for drugs, because you're defined in our prison data by the offense for which you are convicted. And so if you commit domestic violence and when the police come to arrest you, you've got heroin on you, and in the midst of the plea bargaining process, your partner's not going to testify, it's a messy case. So they drop the aggravated assault charge, the domestic violence charge. They just get you to plead guilty to the heroin. But the DA demands prison time because of that assault. You show up in the data as a nonviolent drug offender, because the only thing the data sees is the heroin. They don't see the underlying arrest for the domestic violence, the assault, the robbery, whatever else took place. Right? And so at a minimum, 55% have been convicted of a violent crime. Some even greater fraction of people who are in for drug and property and other crimes are there for violence. We just don't see the violence in the data, right? And so, the total number who are in, it's got to be 60, 65, 70% are actually probably in for some act related to violence. Now, the standard rebuttal at that point is, but the war on drugs causes that violence. And to some degree, there is some element of that, right? When you can't sue over trade disputes, you shoot. But one of the better books out there on this topic, I think, is Ghetto Side by Giuliovi, who is a LA Times correspondent embedded with the homicide police unit in South Central LA. And one of the things she points out is there's this extensive research showing that the causation runs the other way. The drugs come to the violence much more than the violence that the drugs brings about the violence. That when you have young men who don't have a lot of other opportunities and the state does a terrible job enforcing its laws, violence tends to come there. And if you're to just legalize the drugs and not address any of these other underlying social problems that afflict poor communities of color, you'll see some decline in violence, probably. Although you'll see more fights over people who are using drugs. It's very complicated. But my guess is that the bulk of the shift you won't see that giant shift people think that legalization would bring with it, especially if you restrict yourself just to marijuana. Right? About 1% of the prison population is in for marijuana. No one goes to prison for marijuana at all. Right? And so it's this strong blocking point because the public thinks it's about 50%. And I think part of the reason for that is that the feds are about 50% drugs because the Fed system is a weird creature. And the feds get all the national attention. And so they sort of drive the narrative and they're a weird outlier. But at the state level, it's about 55 to 70% are in for violence. And, you know, a recent survey a couple of years ago showed that even strong liberals really don't want to change how we approach violence. And so it's really important to keep just hammering this point home because it's, you know, we will not decarcerate unless we change how we think about violence. And I think we know how to think differently about violence now than we did 10 or 15 years ago. We know there are other approaches in this sort of the brute force tool of prison. So there's reason to be hopeful, but it's tricky.
I want to add that I think liberals often also push for quite aggressive gun laws, and in general, you know, I'm for restricting access to guns. But the criminal approach that we have to a lot of you know, felon in possession of a gun, et cetera, does result in a lot of incarceration for something that isn't technically even showing up in the violent crime statistics because that's not a violent crime. And so I think that getting the knee-jerk idea that we need to use the criminal criminal penalties as a way out of our gun problem is also something that needs to be messaged on the left, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Detroit is actually a great example of that dynamic. I mean, Wayne County sends hundreds of people to prison every year for felony firearm, even when the underlying felony is nonviolent or got probation. It's a pervasive problem. And 91% of those people are young Black men. It's just, and you know, many of those folks are, they're carrying guns for protection in a city where even law enforcement thinks that's a good idea.
And in a state where white protesters can bring guns into the Capitol with no penalty at all.
Yeah, so
Hey, John.
I want to move, Sonia, to the research. You recently co-authored a really great paper reviewing the research on violent crime recidivism. So how predictive is a past conviction for violence of future violent behavior, and what factors influence how predictive that past conviction is?
So, I mean, I think the latter part of your question might be the important part because I think the answer is it depends. I mean, I don't want to sugarcoat things unduly, right? Like, it is the case that having a past violent conviction, statistically, it is predictive of future violence, right? Like the rate of, or at least the rate. So one thing I should say is that whenever we talk about the rates of crime, what we're really talking about is the rates of crime that our criminal justice system measures, right? And so in the vast majority of studies, the outcome that's being measured is something that's actually done by the criminal justice system, like arresting someone for a crime or incarcerating them for a crime. And when we study criminal recidivism, it's often, you know, it's rearrest or reincarceration or something like that. And so we should say that we don't have a good metric for the rate at which people actually commit violence because much violence goes undetected, right? But just looking at the rate in which you get reincarcerated or rearrested, you know, if you aggregate together all people who are released from prison or jail, or the study that we did was looking at prison releases. So for example, in our study, we used as a measure of recidivism the rate at which you were re-imprisoned for another crime, and then we also looked at the rates at which you're re-imprisoned for violent crime. We looked at the rates at which you're re-imprisoned for homicide specifically because we were quite interested in the way our system treats homicide offenders. And so those things, being re-imprisoned for a crime, that is a pretty narrow measure of recidivism because it doesn't count any event that doesn't result in you being sent back into the state prison system, right? But the rate that we find in the aggregate across all violent crime people with violent crime records who are released is that 9% of them 9% of them get reincarcerated for any crime, or re-imprisoned, I should say, for any crime in the next 3 years. And about half of those, it's for a violent crime. It's pretty close to 5% is for a violent crime. Now, is that a high rate or a low rate? Well, it's higher than the rate at which, for sure, than the rate at which people in the general population are getting incarcerated or reincarcerated for
and just to be clear, general population is the public at large,
like
not
the public at large, right? On the other hand, it still means that 95% are not being re-imprisoned for a violent crime. And when you dig into the data a little bit more, you can find subgroups that don't have especially high reincarceration rates, including most importantly older offenders, right? So offender, I'm using offender language, John. Older releasees have quite low rates of coming back for anything, and particularly for violent crime. So if you're over 55 and you've been incarcerated for at least 5 years, then in our data you have about a 1% risk of being re-imprisoned for anything over the course of the next 3 years, and only about 0.5% are re-imprisoned for violent crime. So age is very strongly predictive in our data, in the sense that it's the numbers that I cited on people with violent records coming back for further violence are just overwhelmingly driven by the youngest category or two of those released.
So I want to hit pause there. You've touched on a number of issues I was hoping to discuss. First one being just recidivism stats generally. So in Michigan, MDOC reports about a 26% recidivism rate. That's a return to prison from someone who's released for any purpose. So it's parole violations, but it's also reincarceration for a nonviolent reason. And so the data on recidivism is extremely squishy and particular. So the fact that you guys actually looked at who's going back for violence, and did you guys also look at specifically sort of like people who commit homicides that go back for homicides? Because I think that's sort of the person that the public has in mind.
Yeah, so we were interested, so we looked at violent crime generally, and also at homicide offenders particularly, as well as homicide specifically as the outcome, like this, the question of, do people released after a homicide, what is their rate of subsequent homicides? And we were interested in that because, something, I think it's 14 or 15% of all people in state prisons are there on homicide charges. And also a higher percentage than that of older people who are incarcerated. And so, because the sentences are just so long, right? And so and I think that's because the idea that someone who has killed will kill again is kind of the nightmare scenario that I think drives a lot of our criminal justice policy, and particularly our rather unbending commitment to extremely long terms for homicide, for those incarcerated for homicide. So we found, unsurprisingly, of course, homicide is a much rarer outcome among all classes of people released. We do find that people who have committed a prior homicide are at somewhat higher risk for committing another homicide than people who are released for other kinds of crimes. But it's still only about, depending on the 1% or so overall. And if you looked at older offenders, it would be more like 0.2% or something like that. So it's still overwhelmingly likely, you know, most people are not being
Right.
reconvicted for that. And so just to go back to the different measures though used for recidivism. So what we did with our study, we reviewed our own data in the way that I described, right? And that's corrections data. It comes from state prison systems, and that's why we're focused on readmission to prison as the outcome, because that is what this data set records, right? But we think that for something like homicide as an outcome, that's actually a pretty good measure, because if you get arrested, you know, if you commit a homicide and you know, you get caught and it's provable, right? You're going to be sent back to prison, right? You're not going to be sent to jail. You're not going to be released on probation, right? It's a pretty effective measure of that. And it doesn't accidentally encompass people who are going in for parole violations or you know, some things that we think really ought not count as recidivism. But when you look at studies of recidivism that show much higher rates, when people say, wait, I thought people recidivate at a 60% rate or something like that, those are, first of all, aggregating all parts of the population together, and they're looking at something like rearrest for any cause, right? Which could be a technical violation. It certainly, you know, and often arrests don't result in any charges, much less convictions. So,
okay, I want to hit pause for a minute, and so you've mentioned age as a really important factor, and I'm going to ask John to talk about aging at a crime in 1 second, but I want to go to Troy. So Troy, what is your experience with people serving long sentences in prison? Are those the most dangerous people in prison? Or are those people actually, you know, leaders in the prison community?
Let me lead into that with an experience that I had. We were talking about my time that I spent at Lakeland Correctional Facility for 4 years. I spent 6 years in solitary confinement there. One afternoon, I was having my recreational yard session for an hour, and I was by myself dribbling the basketball up and down the court doing layups. At that time, I was in pretty good shape. And just so happened, the warden, Thomas Burkett, comes out of the school building, and I felt compelled to say, and this was after I've changed, I felt compelled to say, warden, you're the warden, right? And he said, yeah. I said, I just want to let you know that I appreciate the opportunity that I've had to be here, as unfortunate as some may see that it has been, because I've really taken the time to work on myself. And his response was, that's good, but you're not going to be able to take all that credit for yourself, because most people seem to age out of crime. That being said, the population that I interacted with and what I witnessed is that when younger people come to prison, they perceive it as being a sometimes playground experience, sometimes an extension of the streets into prison. Some call it a rite of passage, and it's exhilarating. It's fun for a while. And then as they start to get older, they miss their family, they miss their friends, they miss having no livelihood. As Pepian said, I've wasted my life. And you start to reach some deep conclusions, and you start to live differently and think differently. The challenge for people who are serving long-term in prison, who perhaps once demonstrated violent behavior, is that now they're facing themselves through younger people who are coming through the doors and who are wild and upsetting the environment and causing problems for people who are there. And they may not be there for committing a violent act. But what the role of the person who served a long term in prison, are older, and perhaps committed a violent act, is now they're the peacekeepers, they're the moderators, they're the mediators, they're the ones who to create a more peaceful environment and also to some level of conformity, while not complacency or uniformity to like the way of the system, but they're sought out by even the administration to keep the peace. Now, that's something that's not really talked about quite often. But if you remove the long-term people, the lifers, the people who are deemed violent from the prison yard, I promise you there will be a problem.
Thanks, Troy. I want to go to John now. And so when I started learning about criminal justice research, I heard this term called aging out of crime that I didn't quite understand and found it a little hard to believe. But as I've spent more time learning about it, it's actually kind of an intuitive concept. Can you sort of run through what social scientists mean when they say aging out of crime?
Yeah. So the idea here is that one of the more enduring statistical irregularities with behavior is that people are not just uniformly antisocial over their lives. They tend to age into it and age out of it. You know, and your 3 and 4 year olds are not doing horrible, awful things, but they're doing it the way 3 and 4 year olds do it, right? But you know, it's in your mid-teens that sort of property crime starts and sort of low-level antisocial behavior. As you get into your later teens, it turns more violent. But when you get 30 or 40, that tends to stop. In fact, I think it's one of the most, probably the single most important and underappreciated graph is this graph of aging in, aging out of crime. I can't seem to share my screen, so I did as crudely as I possibly could. I called on my phone. Yeah, of course I get a text message from my neighbor right as I do this. Right, and so it's this graph here, which shows people aging into and then aging out of crime. Some do it sooner, some do it later, right? It's like how likely to commit a crime up at x-axis is age across the bottom. That graph comes from a study of white men in Boston who were born in the 50s for their whole life. But when you look at a graph of black women starting in the 70s in Chicago, exactly the same. If you look at people from Denmark, exactly the same. If you look at people from Canada, exactly the same, right? This is just a trend of human behavior, right? All these people, all these legislators, all these judges, all these prosecutors just say, well, we've got to lock this 18-year-old up like he's a bad person. How many of them 2 minutes later are like, man, I was a hothead when I was a teen. I'm much calmer now. Every single one of them, right? No one who's in their 40s or 50s is the same person they were in their teens and in their 20s for a host of reasons, right? Some of them are biological and chemical, right? It's testosterone levels, serotonin levels. You know, actually one reason why very old, I think it's particularly men, start acting up in nursing homes is that their serotonin levels actually revert to that of a teenager. They're actually kind of like hormonally 18 again, but they're in a 90-year-old body. Is very confusing for everybody involved, right? But it's very biological, right? Some of it is just physical, right? I was never good at fighting in my 20s, but I'm 44 now. Like however fast I would have lost in my 20s, I'm losing twice as fast now, right? I'm slower, things ache, I have a herniated disc. Like I'm just not the same person I was in my 20s. But where it comes to prison, the thing where prison makes things even trickier is many of them are social. Right? So things like having a steady job. When you're at work, you're not with your friends doing dumb stuff. When you have a steady employment, you've got something to lose, something to live for. Also, the stress of trying to pay your electricity bill goes away. And stress is a big causal factor for committing offenses, right? Stable relationships, stable marriage. Again, time in prison directly undermines things that we know are clear pathways towards desistance. And so we have this, it's well understood that people are in their 40s aren't who they are in their 20s. That said, I think the other challenge we face with our recidivism statistics that ties into this, I think Sonia did a great job pointing out that what we define as reoffending is never reoffending, right? It's rearrest, right? And it's much easier to be rearrested in some neighborhoods than others for the exact same behavior, right? Because my neighborhood in Brooklyn has very few police officers. Others are heavily policed, right? I could punch someone in the head and not be touched in my neighborhood because there's no one to see it. Other neighborhoods, there's 6 task force jump out of the trees and snag you. Right? But the other thing is, I think this is the bigger challenge with the way we think about reoffending and recidivism, is we define it as a binary pass-fail, right? It's not sort of desistance, right? It's cessation, right? Either you completely stop having contacts and that's a success, no arrest in 8 years, right? Or you reoffend and that's a failure, right? But that's not how human behavior works, right? Every single parent here will tell you the goal is not to get your kids to behave, right? And it is, but it's also to get them to misbehave less and to grow and to develop, right? And to allow them to slide and make mistakes and to build off of that, right? And so we need to design a recidivism measure, right? This graph doesn't show that at 35 you stop, right? It shows that at 35, you're getting better. And we need a system that allows us to acknowledge that you're not the person you were before, even if you're not flawless. Who amongst us is? But a system that says that sometimes you slip and mistake, but you're getting better, and we can't see it, right? If someone goes to committing 20 robberies a month to 1 robbery a month, that's a huge change in behavior. But all we can see is that one subsequent arrest. We can't see the decline, and we have to think about how to design a system that's able to acknowledge that change is not an immediate success. It's a complicated, dynamic process taking place under some of the most adverse and difficult circumstances imaginable.
Hey, John, can I touch on that a little bit?
Please do. I was actually going to go to you next. So
okay. So I just want to go back just a little bit to you were referring to Detroit and the environment. So one of just a phrase that I say is people don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm gonna go kill someone. I mean, you could take a psychopath and a sociopath and just exclude them from this conversation, since we're talking about people who are making cognitive decisions of an act that they're gonna go commit, knowing that it's right or wrong. And so I was a facilitator in a program that's the flagship behavioral modification program in the Michigan Department of Corrections called Violence Prevention Program. And one of the things that they taught me, and I became advancer of, is that people do what they've seen, heard, and experienced. And so I was never an armed robber until I was on my way home one day and a group of 9 people walked up on me and put a pistol in my friend's face, another one in my face, hit me with it. And as I ran away, I was being shot at, and my friend was stomped out, as we say. And I made a decision one day that I didn't want that to happen to me ever again. It didn't feel good, but this is my environment that I'm going to live in, and how do I survive? I'll give you another example. I have a 30-year-old stepson who actually my wife is going to pick up from jail right now because he was caught with a weapon 2.5 years ago. Because in 2004, he was shot 9 times at a gas station and left for dead in Detroit. So he's caught with a firearm, and the assumption is that he is a potentially a violent person. So when we ask the question, when do violent people who have been labeled as violent recover, I think one of the points of that is acknowledging the fact that they've experienced trauma in their life. And we quite often don't address that as an issue, because for some, they use it as a justification. It's no justification for me. I made a decision. I made a very poor decision, but it was something that I felt would make me feel safer. And as a result of being in that lifestyle, I acted violently. And so I just wanted to kind of touch on that, because there are a number of outcomes, but the question is, what's the lead up to? And so I don't think people want to be violent. There are a number of people, and I also just throw in there was a woman, Debbie, put a question there. It was, why are people concerned with people who have committed violent acts? And I think that fear is a major factor. There's a lot of fear mongering that happens. But also on the other side, the reason why people quite often commit violent acts is as a result of fear. You can be the biggest guy in the neighborhood and be a bully because you've been bullied and you're afraid and you don't want it to happen to you anymore. So I just wanted to frame that a little.
That's great, Troy, and it's actually a really terrific transition to what I wanted to talk about next. So the standard line from opposition to criminal justice reform, to shorter sentences, to more releases earlier, is that reducing sentence length and length of stay is going to reduce the deterrent effect of potential sentences, and thus make the public less safe, because people are not going to be deterred from committing acts of violence. Does that sound right to you, Troy?
I'm sorry, could you frame that for me one more time? So
say I want to reform the sentencing laws in Michigan. I say these sentences are too long. They don't give the parole board the opportunity to consider people for release prior to their minimum sentence. And if we reduce minimum sentences, people wouldn't be deterred from committing violence in the first place. Do you think people are looking at the potential sentence they get and thinking, I'm not sure I want to do this? Or are people committing acts, I guess, out of passion or other other moment-to-moment decisions that they make?
My position will be moment to moment. People, if I go into a jewelry store and say, I'm going to go rob this person with the potential of having a life sentence versus feeding my drug addiction, I'm probably not going to do it because I don't want to go to prison for the rest of my life. However, if what's superseding my rational thinking by I can meet my need, I can cope with whatever my underlying issues are, and I'm going to make that decision based on my emotional and even my physiological drive. So I think that, one of the conversations that we're having, around the sentencing issue, whether a person receives a life term, which we call shocks to conscious, or receives a 30-year term where they can kind of see the light of day, even though it's far off. I think that one of the mechanisms that needs to be in place is something that really gives a person the opportunity to demonstrate like who they are in character, in real time, in an environment that's technically hostile and re-traumatize and continues to traumatize, even if it's even a violent environment. So if there were a component, whatever that looks like in a perfect world, where a person could actually live in an adverse environment, but present themselves to have done the work to no longer be considered a risk or a threat to the community, that is something that should be built into it. I'll give you an example of a defect with the system. I go into prison with an anger problem, and because I'm serving a parolable life term, which I'm eligible for after 17 years in prison, I don't qualify to take an anger management class until I'm within 3 years of my earliest release date. The problem is, if I go in with the anger problem, I'm probably going to continue to demonstrate some type of behavior that may say that I'm still a problem, while I'm just acting off of my impulses and what's given me the ability to survive for a significant amount of time. It works for me, as opposed to give me that program on the front end so I can learn the skills, I can do the self-evaluation, the introspection that's necessary. I can surround myself with people who support me. And then if I continue to demonstrate some types of behaviors, there comes the opportunity to recalibrate that, to correct that, and to actually confront that in real time in a healthy and positive way, so I can work that out. Once I reach that point where I'm demonstrating that, at least in a hostile environment, that I'm an upstanding member of this community where it's hard to be, then I should be considered to be released back into the community, because I've pretty much been forged in the fire.
That makes sense to me, Troy. I want to go to John and Sonia, just because I think the deterrence question is really important. So whoever wants to start is fine, but like,
that's why
the question is like, does deterrence work from long sentences?
That's why I have one thing to Troy's point about like conditions and everything. I think it's important to realize that the low return rate that Sonia's observing is coming in an environment designed in some ways to maximize returns, right? The brutal nature in which our prisons are designed. And I love graphs and pictures. I want to show another picture, again, off my phone. This is a picture of the famous, almost infamous in some ways, Halden prison in Norway. This is Norway's maximum security prison. The person I'm about to show you is a man who's almost certainly been convicted of murder, is probably one of the most serious offenders in the country. And this is his prison cell. It looks like an IKEA showroom, right? They actually call it the IKEA prison, even though it's Norway, not Sweden, and that's vaguely, they're not all the same in Scandinavia.
As a Swede, I object.
As a Swede, I object as well. But the idea is that, you can design institutions that are better equipped to facilitate reentry. And we have designed ours to minimize it, to make them as cruel and savage and brutal as possible, which makes, Troy's point about, if you can survive, if you rehabilitate there, you are ready, true, clearly. I think it also emphasizes that it just emphasizes how, that low return rate that Sonia's seeing, like imagine how much lower it would be if we actually designed facilities that were designed to humanize and restore rather than tear down and destroy. And then I would briefly say about the recidivism is that the data is pretty clear. pretty unambiguous. That longer no sentencing at all might have some issues, right? But as we make our sentences longer, the marginal impact of that is pretty slight, right? And that's because crime tends to be a young person's game, and young people aren't exactly known for their incredibly expansive long time horizons, right? And that's before you get issues of drug addiction and alcohol addiction, right? And so this idea that we keep making sentences longer and longer and longer, that's what's going to deter. The data is clear. What deters is something on the street, right? Whether it's police officers on the street, if it's programs like Cure Violence, right, that work with local people who have been in the system working with young men to try to discourage them and interview them in a way that resonates with them culturally and politically, and know we are your brothers and your neighbors, not just this outside imposing police force coming in, right? We know that that's really what works. And so the idea that we need longer sentences to deter, I mean, it might be how we structure incentives and rewards and what we brag about, but we know very clearly that the impact of longer sentences is pretty slight, if not zero, if not ultimately negative. Given that data shows that the longer you spend in prison month by month, that increases the risk of reoffending when you get released. So it's sort of this weird arms race. Like we might get a little bit of deterrence up front, we get more reoffending on the back end, and how they balance out. The research indicates it probably balances out as a net negative. And yeah, we're making things worse, not better with longer sentences.
And I think that's a point that the public really would be surprised to learn. And it's too bad that it's not better understood, because I think the public is seeing long sentences as something with very little downside, and it really isn't. I mean, incarcerating someone is incredibly expensive to begin with, and it only gets more expensive over time. And, we live in a state where a quarter of our prison population is over 50, and, we're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for medical care out of our state general fund for many prisoners who are in their 70s or 80s. It does not make sense from my perspective.
Well, and plus, any effort to quantify the costs of mass incarceration, like those efforts run aground at the fact that the effects of incarceration are just so sprawling, right? And some of them are so potentially long term. So if you think about crime prevention, you don't just have to think about whether you're preventing today's person that you send to prison from committing crimes. You might also have to think, what is the effect on the crime rate of this person's children going to be in 15 or 20 years if they have had to grow up with their dad in prison, right? And those are things that it's actually a very difficult social science question to try to quantify those effects. But intuitively, it seems like there's likely an effect. And of course, people who have grown up with deprivation in their childhood, and particularly with incarcerated parents, are at higher risk of crime. What the causal component of it is maybe difficult to put a number on.
In fact, that's actually my next big research project, is trying to come up with some rough estimate of that cost. And when you start digging into it, I mean, it's staggering, right? Every year in prison cuts about 2 years off expected lifespan. Prisons, the rate of drug overdose upon release from prisons is sky high in the United States and Denmark, right? It's an unavoidable aspect of prisons. It causes poverty, it causes bankruptcy, it causes families to fray, it causes childhood recidivism, child offending later on in life from the kids. And what's really telling is that we've never, ever bothered to measure this in the past 40 years of prison growth. We just haven't cared, right? And it's clear why we don't care, right? That the population is being impacted by these staggering community level costs. Our communities we tend not to care about politically, but it's hard to understate just how insanely large these costs are going to be when we get any sort of remote estimate of what they are. And that we don't know them yet is a real condemnation of many different policy actors.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great point. I mean, 1 in 10 kids in Michigan has had a parent in prison. And, if you've had a parent in prison, probably you're going to grow up in poverty or housing instability. You're going to have a harder time in school. And all of a sudden you've got, a suite of adverse childhood experiences that are very likely to result in justice involvement down the road. We've got the foster care system. We've got emergency room bills. We've got all the other costs of violence. I mean, it's just really staggering to think about. And unfortunately, we've only really been thinking about it from a policy standpoint, looking at the prison system. It's, $2 billion in Michigan. That's a lot of money. It's too much money. But it's much, much bigger and broader than that.
Yeah.
I think that also, oh, go ahead, Sonia.
Oh, I was just going to say, just to add to John's point about populations we don't care about. I mean, you can't really talk about the impact of mass incarceration in America without talking about racial disparities in incarceration, right? And so, you know, it's just like I know we'll talk more about the COVID situation in prisons right now, but I've had many times in my life of thinking about criminal justice reform, but in particular in the last few weeks, had the thought that, like, what if it were the case that 1 in 9 white men between the ages of 18 and 35 were behind bars at this moment, right? Or that and that the risk of passing behind bars over the next year was even higher than that for white men. Would we be seeing the coronavirus situation behind bars essentially ignored by policymakers? And more broadly, would we, as a broader criminal justice reform matter, would we tolerate a situation like that, right? And you know, I think the answer is obviously no, right? And so I feel like the fact that you know, and then if you look at the rates of incarceration among, if you look at particular neighborhoods that are also suffer from extreme poverty, then the rates get even higher. And so this is really we have an extraordinarily high overall population rate of incarceration, but the rates in those communities are just insane. And I think it's you know, we can't forget that when we talk about these issues.
Yeah, COVID is something I did want to talk about. So let's go to that now. Just to set the table a little bit, you know, Michigan is a state that has been hit very hard by COVID. We've got over 4,000 deaths in our state. We've got over 40,000 cases. Most of those are in Metro Detroit. We also have the second largest prison outbreak in the country with almost 2,000 confirmed cases now, 40-something deaths. And just today I saw it reported that there's still about 850 people in the Wayne County Jail, and 86% of those are there pre-trial. So I want to go to Troy first, just because, Troy, I understand you spent some time at Lakeland. Lakeland's the hot spot in our prison outbreak. There's almost 800 confirmed cases there out of 1,400 people. Can you tell people a little bit about you know, what physically Lakeland is like, and then who is incarcerated there?
Yeah, the number that Lakeland was initially designed for, I think, was around 700 or 800. I think there's 1,400 people there now. There are a few pole barn units. There's a couple dog programs there. I was participating in the Greyhound training program. There's also a geriatric unit that's attached directly to healthcare services, where people have extensive chronic care needs. They don't wander far away from their unit. Many of them are in walkers. It's a true geriatric unit. When I was there, and I believe it's still true today, that half of the population there was serving a life term in prison. Most of them had already served on average more than 25 years. I had a friend named Joe who was there, and I believe that he had served almost 50 years. And Joe is probably one of the greatest guys you would ever meet in life. So the concern that we have around COVID is, one, the Michigan Department of Corrections, as Daniel Hines said when he was the director, the Department of Corrections, or the MCO, their purpose is not to provide healthcare or run the store or do education and security and custody. So within the framework of the Department of Corrections, we don't have what would be qualified as an expert arm in dealing with outbreaks within institutions. So that's a concern, and we're seeing that manifest in not only the contraction rate, but the death rate. And I'm sure that, you know, as you talk a little bit more, I won't take the liberty to do it, but how policies are even affecting people from receiving the care the same type of care as though they would if they were in society, which is a Department of Corrections healthcare policy.
Yeah, so I want to, the Lakeland stuff is really tough. I mean, it's the most vulnerable facility in our system. The average age there is nearly 50. More than half of the people there are over 50. And I pulled up a chart. This is the end of 2018 report, but so there's 16 people over 80, 39 between 75 and 80, 78 from 70 to 75, 108 from 65 to 70, 162 from 60 to 64, and the numbers go up from there. I mean, it's just a profoundly aging prison population. So with that said, I want to draw back the lens a little bit and go to John. I saw that you had an editorial in the Washington Post a few weeks back talking about this issue. Could you talk a little bit about the editorial and what inspired you to write it?
Yeah, I mean, so it sort of goes back to what I was talking at the beginning, that if we really want to, you know, any sort of social distancing, any sort of effort to contain the outbreak of COVID in our prisons, it's going to require one of two things. Right? It's either going to require a significant decrease in the population, or basically, and I know of at least one state that's basically done this, and they appear successful, is basically putting every single person in solitary. Right? If you completely shut down and lock down the facility, COVID can't really spread. But solitary is basically mental and human torture, right? And so if you put them, mostly men, in their cells 23 hours a day, allow them 1 hour outside to shower at best, like, yes, you will contain COVID. And if we thought the pandemic was going to be 1 week, maybe that's how you navigate it. But now that we're looking at lockdown orders through God knows when, right? Like it's locked. That's not an option, right? So it's going to require some sort of substantial carve out, and we're just not willing to do that, right? Just think about Pennsylvania, right? So Pennsylvania tried to issue this furlough law, and the restrictions it put on it was no one convicted of violence, no one convicted of a person crime, which is a slightly different thing that ropes in even more quasi-violent offenses. No one who had ever even been convicted of a violent crime could qualify, among other things, for the furlough program, which immediately excluded about 70 to 75% of PA's population couldn't even apply for the furlough, much less even get it. And when I read this, I thought, okay, the Pennsylvania legislature, it's dominated by very conservative Republicans. This seems like where they would start. But no, that was actually where the Democratic governor started. That was his opening bid to the Republican legislature in Pennsylvania, was a bill that would do absolutely nothing, right? And so, this is the problem. And where that piece actually started is actually started back in January. Didn't want to announce the COVID part came in a little bit later towards the end, but it ties very much into the COVID account, was about how we responded to the commutations in Kentucky when Bevins issued these commutations in December, and how we reacted 1 week later when the Pennsylvania Board of Parole shot down every application for early release, right? And so Bevins issues hundreds of these releases. They actually won a Pulitzer for the coverage of this, which I think is very, I'm not thrilled with this Pulitzer Prize being awarded, right? And what they did is they dug through them to find 3 or 4 very salacious ones, and they were problematic, but not as problematic as the Courier Journal made them seem. And they highlighted, he pardoned someone convicted of murder. There were about 1,000 pardons. They find the one murder and they jump on that, and that immediately became a viral story that wins a Pulitzer Prize, right? A week later, there are about 15 lifers up for early release in Pennsylvania. The wardens are there arguing in favor of release, and the board shoots all but one of them down and delays 1 vote. And that got nothing, no coverage whatsoever. And that's the problem, right? If you make one bad release that comes back and does something wrong, that is politically risky. If you keep 100 people unjustly in prison, there's no discussion of that whatsoever. And so what every governor, Democratic and Republican alike, and every mayor and every parole board, they're making a very clear, very cynical, but perhaps very politically astute decision, right? It is politically better for them that 20 men die in prison from COVID that could have been prevented than one of them do something bad upon release. And it is horrible, and it is gut-wrenching, and to the people whose family members are in prison is a horrible thing to have to live with, but they're not necessarily politically wrong, however morally wrong they are, right? And the coverage of Bevins versus the PA Board of Pardons shows exactly what that political calculus is and why they make these decisions. I think we really have to confront both how we cover criminal justice, right? How we always focus on the one salacious bad thing that happens and never on the mass dishumanity that takes place, right? I saw this also in New York City a couple months ago when the RFK fund tried to bail out every woman and child from Rikers. There's this huge uproar about this approach. And what struck me, the New York Times dedicated about 20 paragraph articles, both to the announcing of the program and its termination. So this is well covered. And what struck me is that every one of these discussions, it was all about what kind of danger did these people being released pose, right? The DAs and the police saying they're gonna be horrible, the public defenders saying you're being too nervous. And then when they were over, the stories were all, look, no one got hurt. Never discussing any of this was what would a bailout in November, Thanksgiving, mean for the people being bailed out, for the women and children who are going home to their families over the holidays. None of that even the public defenders weren't quoted that. They might have said it, but didn't make the article, right? And this is how we frame everything. And the COVID discussion is no different, right? We have to make sure we don't get harmed by these people, but that's condemning many of them to preventable deaths, but they're not quite people, right? There's something less in our political discourse. And so their deaths count less than the harms to those of us on the outside. And to me, that's the profound moral failing, is they're not viewed as people. They're lesser than people, and therefore their deaths don't count quite so much. And therefore, let's kill some of them to keep the rest of us completely safe. And that is exactly the calculus they're making. And it should make us feel kind of sick, I think.
Hey, John, I have to say something here. So the other John made a great point about the way the story is told, the narrative. So, we call it the 30-70 factor. And so when we take pride that our recidivism rate is counted at 30% in Michigan, and we don't talk about the 70% that's coming home and is doing well, thriving, contributing, bringing peace to bad neighborhoods, being called upon to go into risky situations to defuse them, and not acknowledged for that. And then there's that, that one bad apple, that one person released in Florida who goes and does some crazy stuff. And they probably knew that he was probably one of those people who should probably not have been released. And then we also don't talk about, because we don't want to get off into the Minority Report mentality and as predictors of who's going to do what, but it's the guy who works next to me on the line in the factory who's going to prison next, and he's never been in trouble before, and perhaps for something violent. When we talk about people, I also work closely with an organization called Nation Outside. It's all formerly incarcerated people. Most of them have committed acts of violence, but we're working on a project called the Memorial Project. And if it's okay, these names are public. I'd just like to cite a few names with their age in honor and recognition of people whose lives have been lost as a result of this and didn't have to. For instance, Jack Reynolds Earl was 79 years old. Vaughn Rogers was 82 years old. And Susan Mary Farrell was 74 years old. And so when we look at our grandfathers or our fathers who are at that age, and we wonder how much of a risk or a threat they are to the community, just visually, we don't see them as a threat. And then secondarily, the negligence that we collectively as a society have demonstrated is that we haven't taken time to get to know them. And we don't know what they've done, how many lives they poured into, that where in Colorado, Evan Ebel was sent out into the community like a Scud missile and went and killed the director of their corrections. While at the same time, people have the potential to do that, young and foolish, and you have an older person who may only have the opportunity to live vicariously through someone who's going home because they'll never get the chance, and they prevent things like that from happening. So there's this dynamic that we have to identify and try to implement ways of getting to know people. As American Friends Services Committee has a Good Neighbor Project, they're getting to know people. It's a peer-to-peer mentoring between good upstanding members of the community and people who've done really bad things and have fur on their face and fangs and claws, right? And that's how we see them. But once you get to know them, you start to realize that this is a person just like me, but by the grace of God, I would be there right with them.
Yeah, sure, that's a great point. And I was just gonna just do a check-in with the audience, because we would normally go to questions around now, and I just had a couple other things I wanted to cover, and I was gonna run through sort of what I think the policy implications are, and you guys can disagree or agree. And then I want to spend just a couple minutes about talking to opponents. You know, as John pointed out, this is hard, and the public isn't necessarily supportive of releases for people who have committed serious crimes. And I think, you know, we as advocates for reform have an obligation to talk to and about victims of serious crimes in a respectful way, in a constructive way. And so I want to jump to that. But just so from a policy implication standpoint, so sentences should be shorter. People who are aging should be prioritized for release, and, you know, most should be released unless there's red flags. We should reduce length of stay overall, and we should have a more flexible parole system. The last thing I see is what Troy mentioned about getting people the programming they need early in their stays so they can get moved through the system more quickly. Anything to add from the panel to those sort of big picture policy implications?
Yeah, I would add that in general, I mean, my view is that we should also think about sort of the fairness with respect with the way we treat people convicted of the same things when we sentence them, and that it's not my view that a person who is 60 today and a person who's 20 today who come in and have just committed the same crime should be sentenced differently because the 60-year-old is at statistically lower risk. But I would say that if we lower sentences overall, it will naturally solve the problem, at least in the future, it will solve the problem of the aging prison population, right? That's a byproduct of decades now of very long sentences that we've been giving. Right now, in the COVID situation, I think there is a particular urgency to getting people who are older removed from the incredibly dangerous situation that they're in.
And I guess I would add that, I mean, I agree obviously with all those policy implications. I'd point out that we are the only Western country where the parole board responds to a democratically elected governor, right? In the most places, part of a judiciary that's not elected but appointed and politically isolated. So we have the only politically accountable parole boards. That makes them very, very tentative. You know, the former head of the New York State Parole Board said they had a two-step schematic for deciding parole. One, will this case appear on the cover of the New York Post? If yes, deny, right? And if we're not going to appear on the cover of the New York Post, then let's debate the merits of it, right? But I would also add, you know, one thing we haven't talked about, and I say this as someone who doesn't entirely buy into the idea personally, but I understand its utility as a framework, and I've definitely drifted more in this direction over the course of my career, is thinking about sort of the idea of what exactly is even like sort of the abolition altogether, right? And, you know, even Sweden and Norway have prisons, right? But I think the benefit of sort of abolitional thinking, right, is I think about my neighborhoods. Very low crime, no police presence, right? They function not because law enforcement's down in every corner. They function because there's other stronger social networks holding it together. And there's no reason poor, high crime neighborhoods can't function the same way, right? And so to me, it's a way of trying to think about it in terms of like, what do we need to give these neighborhoods so they can look like mine, right? Rather than sort of giving on them and just using policing, right? And it's very, very important in the COVID time today, right? New York State is about to see its budget just eviscerated by this, right? And so the city and the state are getting ready to slash everything left and right. But as things stand today, you know, the DOC's budget, which is not a big share, is going to remain untouched as far as we can tell. And, you know, our nominally progressive mayor seems to be taking no steps to cut the NYPD budget, right? You know, and in many jurisdictions, New York City is weird. In New York City, the police is about 15% of the city budget, but there's weird things about New York City's budget that drive that, right? But in many places, in Chicago, CBD is 30% of Chicago's budget, right? In most cities, they're between 20 to 40% of the city budget goes towards policing. And so this idea of like, where are we going to make our cuts, right? If we're going to slash housing and food support and education to the bone, but keep policing there, right? Like that's a mindset of we can't help these neighborhoods look like our neighborhoods. We're just going to militarize them and enforce order, right? And when it comes to cuts, like maybe we got to cut the police budget. It's a very tricky issue, right? Like you do need some policing to keep things safe as you transition to a more stable structure. But I think, to me, the power of the abolitionist thinking is it forces you to constantly think like, well, my neighborhood doesn't need police to function. So what do I need to get other neighborhoods to be like that, rather than to make their policing better, but keep them as a policed neighborhood while mine remains unpoliced? And as we think about where to slash our budgets, and every state almost certainly is going to be slashing budgets like crazy now, I think that's a broader sort of, it's not a direct policy, but when we think about the policy trade-offs, ask yourself, why can't their neighborhood look like mine? And what do I have to do to get their neighborhood to look like mine, not like some given abandoned policed neighborhood that we generally do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just from a policy standpoint, I'll make it short, is we are positioned as probably the most punitive country on the planet. And so when a person enters into the criminal justice system, the prosecutor takes over. And quite often, and I'll give you a segue to talking about survivors of crime, are so often, if not always, excluded, except for serving as a witness for conviction, excluded from the process. And if there were a process that were more restorative, that would hold a person accountable, prison doesn't hold a person accountable. It holds you in suspended animation. Now, if you want to hold a person accountable, find out what that survivor needs to make things right, and give that the opportunity to face that person the opportunity to face that down while they're in jail before negotiations and offers and trials begin. And then we'll be working toward not only individuals being healed, but a society being healed as a whole.
Hey, Troy, I think you hit the nail on the head for the next section. I mean, I do think it's really important to talk about punishment and talk about victimization. I mean, I don't think anybody, who wants criminal justice reforms wants more victimization or is in favor of victimization, yet that's the way that reforms are portrayed by opponents. So I want to give each of you just a moment to talk first about, how you think we should talk to opponents and how we should talk about victimization. So whoever wants to start.
So I have some views on this, although I have to say that the way that I'm going to say that I think so I'll start with the way that I think maybe more effective messaging about what has happened now with the COVID situation. But then I have to add the caveat that I've been doing that kind of messaging, and John's been doing it, and a million other people have been doing it, and it's been falling on completely deaf ears. So what do I know? So with COVID, I actually think we just have an urgent situation, right? And we need action immediately. Right. I feel like this is born of maybe the cynicism of seeing how our society thinks about people behind bars, right? That the pitch has got to be, it's not just the lives of people behind bars that depend on this, right? It is the lives of all of us, right? That the public safety danger of allowing massive sites of mass infection to take place behind bars, and then to be spread from those locations largely by corrections officers who come and go every day, as well as people who are necessarily released, because tons of people are released from institutions, from correctional institutions all the time. That is a much bigger danger to public safety than whatever small crime risk would be posed by releases. And I think that, the urgent thing is getting people away from the site of risk. So I think it's also helpful to not frame it necessarily as release, but potentially as transfer to home confinement, just moving people into a safer situation where they don't necessarily, you know, we can fight the bigger battle of ending people's sentences later, right? Right now, the question is saving people's lives. And so, and I think it is, by the way, absolutely true that the crisis of coronavirus behind bars does threaten our ability as a society to contain the pandemic, right? That I saw a week ago or so a list of the 10 biggest sites where coronavirus was spreading in the U.S. and 8 of them were prisons and jails. Like, this is a vulnerability to this pandemic that the United States has that other countries in the world don't have, and that is one of the reasons that we are becoming the global epicenter of this crisis, right? More broadly, I think messaging, I think that a problem is that crime stories like I haven't heard the thing about the Pulitzer Prize, but like the story that John told, they tend to be told in individual terms, right? It's not crime statistics, it's here is this victim, right? That's why when you have new acts that get passed that add new consequences to the criminal justice system, whether it's collateral consequences or increases in sentences, they tend to carry, the act tends to, the law will carry the name of some particular crime victim. That kind of messaging is what human beings relate to, right? We don't relate to numbers, we relate to people. And so I think the messaging more broadly on criminal justice reform has got to tell the story of individual people, and it's got to include crime victim perspectives, and particularly if there are success stories with restorative justice, it's got to include victims saying, like, this is why this process was more meaningful to me than seeing the perpetrator locked up for longer. There's got to be sort of faces that are at the forefront and not just numbers.
Yeah, and I guess I would add, first of all, I guess I'm less skeptical than Sonia about what our efforts are doing. Like, most right now, people seem to resist it, but I think, you know, just ideological shifts take time. You just keep battering at it. You know, one police reformer told me it takes 3 police chiefs to change a department. The first 2 seem to fail, but they sort of crack the culture in ways that no one can really see. And the third one gets all the glory for reforming the department, but he really sort of built on the cracks that happened. And I've seen that, right? I've seen, you know, people who have consistently trolled me on this issue in sort of a high profile kind of way, like, their language shifts a little bit. I'm not even sure they realize it. And like, I think it's a slow, painful process at the start, but I think it's having an impact. I think Sonia's right about changing the narrative. I think there are sort of 2 aspects to think about. One, sometimes telling those positive stories are hard, right? During the bail reform debate that New York has been going through, you know, the New York Post and the DAs and the police, every single jaywalking to murder, they would try to link the bail reform and discovery reform. And people were saying, like, public defenders, like, you see the successes on, like, people being released and getting treatment. Why aren't you telling their stories? And every public defender said, because they don't want us to. Right? They don't want, like, Joe doesn't want his face up there as a poster boy for the guy who got out of Rikers and got his drug addiction under control. Joe wants to get out of Rikers, get his addiction under control, and go about his life very, very, very anonymously from the media, right? And so there is an inherent asymmetry. The DAs can post any story they want. The police can perp walk anyone they want. But the success usually means disappearing from the system. They don't, we're demanding that the people impacted by the system expose themselves to more risk to tell their stories. And that's a very difficult ask. And we're going to struggle for a very long time to overcome that asymmetry. That said, I think, let's talk about the victims, right? And victims are generally portrayed as a harsh, punitive group. And that's definitely how tough on crime dinosaurs want them to be portrayed. And they are a much more nuanced, complicated, diverse, fractured set of people, right? And one great example of that, I think one reason why we can talk about violence now when we couldn't even say 10 years ago, is that 10 years ago, we didn't really have alternatives, right? We shouldn't punish them with prison. We should do something. I don't know what. Now we know what, or we have a better example. You know, one example is restorative justice, and we see this in Brooklyn, right? Restorative justice. Brooklyn has a huge restorative justice program. Danielle Surratt runs it. She has wrote a book called "When We Reckon, Once We Reckon, Until We Reckon." There we go. And she tells a story about this mother whose son was aggressively beaten up and robbed. And the mom said her first, and the DA said that this case qualifies, if the mom wants it, for restorative justice. and the mom was talking to Danielle, and her first story was, she said first she wanted to set the guy on fire. Then she wanted to drown him in a river of ice. And then she settled on she wanted to drown him in a river of fire. That's where she ended up, right? So this is not someone who felt like some profound love and compassion for the man who victimized her son. But she said, I see who comes back from New York State's prisons. I see who comes out of restorative justice. I want restorative justice because these people come out aware of what they've done. They've taken accountability. They understand the harms they've caused, and they are simply better. Not better is a wrong word, but they seem on a much better path than people coming out of prison. And the fact is, of those cases that the DA authorizes for restorative justice, 90-some% opt in for restorative justice instead of the usual punishment system, right? And so victims actually are a very complex group. And if we want to talk about victims, which we should, like, they understand both the costs of crime and the costs of bad policy, right? Who is electing all of our progressive prosecutors is disproportionately the communities that are most impacted by policing, right? The ones who we claim to speak for are the ones who are saying, listen to us, right? Stop telling us we want harshness. We don't actually want that because we see how it doesn't work, right? And I think trying to tell that story, that this is in fact what the victims want. It's not just like, liberal progressives living in the suburbs who are unaffected by this, which is an accusation leveled at me quite often, right? Not that Brooklyn is a suburb anymore, right? But that I don't have any skin in the game, right? But I'm saying the people who are electing the progressives, they have all the skin in the game, and they're making a very different choice. I think we can talk about that there.
Hey, John?
Yeah.
I have to, I'm sorry.
Please.
Well, when we talk about survivors, I'm sorry, I don't mean to correct anybody, but I refer to them as survivors as opposed to victims, partially for a personal reason. I'm a survivor of sexual assault. I'm a survivor of gun violence. And when I think about how society has evolved into this punitive state, it's comes from my belief that hate becomes you. And the things that you hate the most, you start to become like that. Or the things that you fear the most, you start to become like that. And so, like, there's two types of prisoners in our society: those who are living behind bars and those who are free, held captive by whatever traumas they've experienced. And so I think that the most powerful means of messaging that I have been able to practice, and I didn't start off this way in this conversation, but it's to acknowledge what I've done and to say, not only do I apologize and I vow to live out the rest of my life to be a better person, to demonstrate the regret and the shame for what I've done, not only to an individual, but how it radiates out to the stakeholders. And then to fulfill that. And I think that there was a question that came up in the chat box, even about the interaction between people who are living in prison and correction officers. And they're being traumatized just as much by that environment. I've seen young people come in fresh. We call them, they were green tags, and they were idealists, and they wanted to come in and help somebody. And you see them 5 years later, and they're hard as a stone. And you wonder how that happened. It's the environment that does it to you. And so there's really this, first of all, there's policies in place that keep you kind of from living out that I'm sorry lifestyle, because it's called overfamiliarity. And the closest person to you, to society, or who reflects society, is your keeper, the correction officer. And so that relationship is stifled. So I won't make it long, but I think the most powerful messaging for people who are formerly incarcerated, who have committed bad acts, is to be comfortable with, number one, naming the trauma that they experienced, not as a justification, but saying, this gives me the ability to identify with other people who have survived things very similar to what myself or other people who I represent reflect, project in front of them, and re-traumatize them all over again, to say I'm sorry. And as a result of what I've done, and people who I know who have come to be good people because they're sorry too, we'll do whatever we can to make it right.
Yeah, that's very well put, Troy. And I want to just linger on restorative justice for a moment. We've been getting a ton of questions, and we're touching on a lot of them, so I'm going to keep going.
Hey, John, we have about 4 minutes left before this is going to shut down.
Yep, we'll get it in time. So, John, I'm glad you brought up Danielle Surratt and the work she's doing in Brooklyn. It's really terrific, and I think it models some alternative ways of dealing with violence and dealing with crime in our society. You know, I think it's important to sort of point out to everybody that, you know, what is being offered by a long prison sentence is it's punishment and it's incapacitation, but it's not necessarily rehabilitation or, you know, any sort of material impact on public safety. And the victim is sort of offered punishment and offered incapacitation, but not other things that they might want. And Danielle does a really good job of explaining that dynamic in her book. And our experience is that the victims prosecutors like to talk about when they're opposing reforms tend to be ones that wanted long sentences, and ones that maybe didn't, and maybe have a more complex view of what violence and victimization really is in our society. Those folks don't get listened to, and they don't get much time of day with opponents. And I think that's just one of the very challenging political and media dynamics we have to deal with. But, you know, panels like this, the work Troy's doing with Nation Outside, other groups, the research that you guys are doing, that all contributes to changing the narrative around violence and working towards a more restorative system. So I want to thank all you guys for the work that you're doing. I want you to keep it up. Sonia, please don't get discouraged. It's going to take time to turn this ship around, but we're working on it. And with that, I'll give Josh the opportunity to read us out.
Hello, everybody. I just wanted to apologize for not getting to the question and answer period. We will try to make sure that your questions get answered and send them out in an email that comes after this webinar. Please do us a favor and answer our exit survey. Safe and Just Michigan thanks you for participating in today's event. We'll be hosting an upcoming webinar on the sex offender registry soon. On the screen, we've included several ways that you can keep in contact with Safe and Just Michigan. Thanks again for participating in today's panel.